All right, what's up everybody? So today's video, how I got jacked delts naturally. And this is something that a lot of people have been waiting a long time for me to release. So I want to give you guys my entire thoughts on how I got my delts big. Was it the right method? Was it optimal? What did I do? Was I doing anything crazy? Was it just genetics? There's so many variables that come into muscle growth, and I do want to touch on a few of the major ones here, including genetics, mindset, in the actual training approach. So there's a few things that I think all tie in together that are major factors. Let's get to it. The first one, let's look into genetics, and I'm going to do a little bit of a self-assessment here. I'm no expert on genetics, but I've been involved in the space enough to know where I stand, and I can pretty quickly assess where other people stand. I'd be curious to see if anybody else maybe does have more experience than I do when it comes to genetics in bodybuilding, what you think, where you think I stand. I'm going to give myself a pretty objective review here, and obviously maybe I'm somewhat biased since it's myself, but I have no attachment to my genetics at all, so I think it will be pretty objective. When it comes to genetics, let's look into myself. So I think the one thing that I do have going for me is I have a decently wide frame. If you look at just some of my posing videos, or you just look at me like shirtless or whatever, you can see I have a decently wide frame. It's nothing crazy. It's not like a pro bodybuilder or like genetic freak material at all, but I'm probably in like the 70th, maybe 75th percentile, probably above average. So I think that definitely does help me out. But I don't think that's a big enough variable to say that's the reason that I grew my delts pretty well, because it doesn't actually mean that much. When it comes to something like lats, I do think that has helped me out for sure, because that your lats, just the way they attach, your width and the size of your waist does make a difference in how your lats look. But when it comes to delts, your delts more so sit on top of your shoulder. So the muscle mass, whether you have a small, narrow frame or a wider frame, the muscle mass is going to be the same. It's just where it is. It doesn't change like lats, where if your lats are way out here or your delts are way out here, it's pulling your lat out farther and it looks way different. For delts, I don't think that makes too much of a difference, but visually it can make them, I guess, it can draw your eyes to my delts on my frame more than it would someone that has a very narrow frame, even if the muscle mass is the same. But the key here is the muscle mass. That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at the aesthetics today. So I actually do have high delt insertions, in my opinion. I think objectively looking at it, the people that have good shoulder genetics, their muscle bellies are much closer to their insertions. So if your delt inserts, say, halfway down your upper arm, their muscle bellies go pretty low. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head, but I'd say most pro bodybuilders and people with good genetics, their shoulders and their side delts come down nice and low. Mine don't. I think at best I have average genetics for this. I actually think I have slightly below average, maybe about 40th percentile for something like this. So yes, I have a wider frame, but at the same time, when it comes to the muscle belly, I have a hard time thinking that I'm just some genetic freak. I think I'm average at best, probably slightly below. But that's not too big of a deal, whether it's a little above or a little below. I'm basically average in my opinion here. Another thing that I think works against me is I'm not particularly tall. I'm also not like short. I'm 5'9", so I think that's a pretty average height, I want to say. I have definitely more of like a tall person's bone structure, if that makes sense. So with my channel, most people assume that I'm 6 foot or taller just because I have long limbs and I have a wider frame, so I almost look like I'm tall. I also have short ceilings down here, so I know that that definitely makes me look taller than I am when you see me in my squat rack and whatnot. But I think I do have the structure of a taller person. I'm just not that tall. Not something that I think plays a huge role, but in most cases, if you're going to look at the shorter bodybuilders versus the taller guys that are both maybe with the same training experience, the taller guys' delts are going to be bigger and they're generally going to look better. So I think I'm somewhere in between there. I'm not particularly gifted or particularly shortchanged in terms of genetics with height. I'm just completely average. And next, I do want to play a clip from a recent podcast from Steve Shaw and Dave McConey the other day that I was listening to. It's a great clip because I think Steve just does a good job. He's talking about the noble natties, in particular, Jeffrey Verdi Schofield and Alpha Destiny, well, now Alex Leonidas. And what he's talking about here is it's not the physical genetics, because I think you look at somebody like Alex and you look at myself, and I think we have, like, physically, we have a pretty similar structure and a pretty similar build. He is a few years ahead of me for sure. I still have a ways to go to be as muscular as he is, and that's for sure. He's got a great physique, and it's definitely a realistic goal of mine, I'd say. But physically, he's not a genetic freak, and neither am I. But there is one thing that I'll let Steve talk about right now that does maybe separate me or him from us with the same physical genetics, but not being able to achieve that physique.
There's two basic levels to this. Number one, I think anybody has the potential to do what they do, not necessarily be clones of them, but achieve achieve something very, very dramatic to their physique. I believe people have that potential, but I believe from my experience, the number of people that have the drive and all the pieces and mechanisms to actually get to that point, they're special. They're pretty rare. I think that's a missing variable that isn't stressed enough with people that are successful. Is it's not just a calculus formula.
So to continue and build off of Steve's point here, I think he sums it up really well, but I think there's something that I had during this time when I really was building up my delts and made the most progress here, that it's not my physical genetics. You look at myself and let's say I'm completely average or maybe slightly above average, but nothing to where it genuinely gives me an actual edge. It's the absurd level of competitiveness that I had, especially at that time. And the tough part is this isn't entirely genetic. It's definitely something that my brain is wired in a way to be stupidly competitive and to just chase after things to an extreme. And it's a double-edged sword. And I do think I was born that way. Like, I don't know if that's entirely genetic, because I think it is something you can change. Like, you can't change your insertions of your muscle belly, but I was everything that I've done, I've gone 110% into at the expense of other areas of life. I've never been a well-rounded person, and I probably never will be, because I just get depressed when I try and be well-rounded. And that's one thing that I do want to make the point on, is that when I'm going after something, I have extra mental capacity to chase after it, because it's at the expense of other things. Like, there's other areas of my life that suffer because of it. And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. I'm just so skewed to pick something and just go all in, like tunnel vision on that. Like, as crazy as it sounds, back when I was growing my delts primarily, and this is actually during my power building phase in like 2018 and 2019, even parts of 2020, but my purpose in life was to grow my delts. And I think that's a point where it's like, oh, well, if I bias the lengthened position on this lift and this person's biasing the shortened position, that's why I got bigger delts. Like, I don't think it's anything like that, because, like, yeah, my frequency was there, my volume was there too, and I do think that played a role, but that's not the entire story. And I think the other half of the story that we can't grasp entirely is that, like, my mental health depended on how big my delts were. And it's not like, oh, I lost size in my delts, now I'm depressed and I hate my physique and I hate myself. It's like, all I cared about was growing my delts. I had this obsession, and I still do. I'm still lifting, of course, but in particular with my delts at this time, where growing my delts was the highest priority in my life. I had a part-time job so I could lift more. And that's just something that I'm not telling you to do it or not to do it, but just objectively, like, that's the mindset that it takes to be that successful. Not entirely, but that's a big reason of why I had those jacked delts and blew them up so quick. And it's really interesting to look back on, because obviously I have a little bit more balance and everything in my life now, but mentally I'm still, like, I think about lifting I visualize my sets. I like everything I think about is just revolving around bodybuilding. And I don't think that's entirely genetic. I think in my case it kind of is, but I do think that's something you can build up to. And that's why I don't think this thing is entirely genetic. And I almost call this like the athlete's advantage, where I think people that were former athletes, let's say you start lifting after college in your mid 20s or whatever, the people that played college sports or high school sports, especially competitive team sports, maybe like football or hockey or something, those people typically will have better results in the gym, not because they're better genetically. I do think there are certain cases where people that are more gifted are drawn towards more towards sports, so you can make a little bit of an argument there. But in the vast majority of cases, I think it's usually the athletes and the people that have that competitive background that really know how to push themselves to the limits physically and have that almost like extreme mindset. Those are the people that end up having the most success. And sure enough, that was me. I never went to college, but I was a high school athlete and I took it very seriously. It's the same mindset that I have towards bodybuilding now. It was just to hockey before. And I think that gave me an advantage. I think I was partially born with it, but I think it was partially developed because I set goals, I had role models, and I had things that I wanted to achieve. This wasn't just, oh, I'll stop by at the gym for 30 minutes after work and then get back to whatever I want to do, just go in and get out. It's entirely different. It's an obsession, I'd call it. And I'm not going to say it's a good or bad thing because I don't think it is objectively good or bad, and I don't think that's the right way to look at it. But that's just I'm just thinking out loud here. That's a peek inside my mind a little bit. And let's see. When it comes to the actual programming and everything, this is the other half that I do think makes a big difference. And this is why I think I had more success with, say, my delts growing than other muscles growing. Because when you look at that power building phase that I was all in on 5 things, 100% all in on 5 things. It was getting my squat up as much as I possibly could, doing whatever I could to get my squat up. Copy and paste that to the deadlift, copy and paste that to the bench. Those are the first 3. The other 2 I was entirely focused on was growing the shit out of my delts, and same exact thing with my lats. So when it came to actually growing my delts and my lats, the pillars of programming and a lot of the conclusions that I've come to and a lot of the things that I've learned about lifting and programming, they actually hold up pretty well when I was in this phase. And I think this is the technical, the programming half of why I was able to grow my delts that big during this point in my training. So the first thing that makes a ton of sense in my mind is the frequency. I was training my delts 3 times a week. I was doing about 2 overhead press variations twice a week, and I was doing a ton of isolation work all 3 times during those sessions during the week. I think the biggest key to me growing my delts was I wasn't having a top heavy approach like I was for every other muscle group. It was the classic like pseudo powerlifter, power building for hypertrophy approach where you go all in on the bench and then you do just some half-fast flies and some half-fast like half range of motion incline dumbbell press for the chest. You see that all the time. It's hilarious. Talked about that before. But for my delts, I did my compound lifts and I did my isolation work, and it's a compound and an isolation. It's not a prime mover and an accessory like a lot of people would refer to the stuff as. And each of them had an appropriate intensity and mindset towards them. Like I didn't just half-ass a 3 set of 10 to RPE 7 on isolation lifts for my delts. I would train them brutally hard. And the only other person that I've seen do these types of lifts for the delts is actually Jeffrey Verdi Schofield. The way he trains through a lot of his isolation lifts for his arms or for his delts, this is pretty much what I was doing 3 times a week, super high volume for my delts, and it worked really well. And I'm not saying this is the best way or the most efficient way to go about it because I don't necessarily know if it is the best way to do it, but it's the focus and it's the ability to push to and beyond failure that helped me when it comes to this. And I was doing it often. As soon as I was recovered and able to do more, I'd get right back in there and get right back after it. I didn't hit them once a week or twice a week on a half-fast split. I was going all in. I was willing to go to the point that you're you're so uncomfortable because of how much it burns and how much it hurts, not in like an injury sense, but just the local fatigue. It's just ruthless when you get to this point. And I think if you have that mindset that I had of the only thing that matters in my life is how big I can get, especially in my delts, you're willing to go to that point, and it's you get so uncomfortable, but it pays off, and you almost enjoy it in a weird way. So it's this strange obsession that I think helped me a ton here. So when it comes to volume, I was actually probably doing about 35-ish sets per week, probably about 6 to 8 sets a week of overhead press variations. I was typically just doing a standing military press. You could argue how much I needed to do that. Most of my volume was made up of lateral raises and band face pulls and reverse pec deck when I could get it. Common struggle if you go to a commercial gym actually getting the pec deck. Even when the gym's not busy, everybody seems to gravitate towards it for some reason. They sit on it forever, which is why I have the home gym now. But this mindset and this approach where I would just hammer the crap out of these muscle groups, that's what led to my results, in my opinion. So I'm going to leave the video at that. I will see you guys in the next one.